Shiloh had worked at the same office for years, and she had begun developing casual relationships with the people that she passed in the halls. The conversations were always brief, but they offered a small level of comfort to her that added to her overall desire to stay at the otherwise monotonous job. Of the people that she spoke to the most, she was most friendly towards the members of the custodial staff, who she thought to be the most underpaid and the hardest workers. For them, she was overly nice and extremely sympathetic. When Tomas was assigned to the area that she worked at, she thought nothing of it at first. He was an older, quiet man that simply smiled at her when he grabbed the trash from her cubicle, and then he would leave without saying a word. Eventually, the man began speaking to her, and Shiloh was delighted. They would chat primarily about simple things: the weather, the day of the week in relation to the weekend, and general how do you do's. The conversations were short, but Shiloh could sense that he wanted to share more with her. She began opening up the conversation a bit more in order to encourage the conversation, and she would make a point to ask him about his interests, be it in movies, books, and shows, and about what he did over the weekend. Tomas never really gave her an answer. He would keep it short and would instead change the subject of the conversation to her, urging her to say more about herself and to allow him to get to know more about her. She didn't think much about it at first and assumed that he just did not like talking about himself to her, which was fine and understandable. But as weeks went by, the questions started to make her feel uneasy. Instead of asking her about television or about movies, or anything else simple for that matter, he began asking her very probing and personal questions about her relationships, who she lived with, and if she ever felt unsafe at night. Shiloh was an overly honest person, and she told him that she was single, that she lived alone, and that she lived in a relatively safe neighborhood where she didn't really feel nervous at home alone. He then asked her where she lived, and she gave him an answer, but she couldn't help but to feel a bit uneasy giving him this information. He began lingering in her office for longer periods of time, and he refused to leave, even when she told him that she needed to get back to work. A male employee began to even notice how strange his behavior was, and began coming to her cubicle intentionally each time that Tomas would enter the room. Andrew, her coworker, stayed in her cubicle for as long as Tomas stayed in the area. One time he even stayed as long as an hour before Tomas finally left. They weren't sure if Tomas understood the hint being presented to him, and Shiloh began to feel a sense of paranoia and unease over the entire situation. She eventually began leaving the cubicle to go to the restroom or to get coffee around the time that Tomas would typically come around to pick up trash. Noticing this behavior, Tomas changed the time of day that he came by, and he did it with such sporadicness that it was hard for Shiloh to guarantee that she would miss him. On Valentine's Day, she came in to work to find a note scribbled on her whiteboard that read, "You will be mine, Valentine." There was no signature, but she knew it was him. She confronted him about it, but he refused to state that he had written it. A few weeks later, when she went on vacation, he texted her to see why she had left him. He asked her questions about who drove her to the airport because he knew that she didn't drive herself since the car was still in the driveway. When she didn't respond, he threatened to break into her house using her spare key that she kept hidden in her garden. Shiloh had never given him this information, and she began to freak out. She texted him back to state that he needed to leave her alone and that she'd report him to the police if her camera saw him break in. He didn't respond for a while, and just when she was starting to feel at ease, her coworker Andrew, now her boyfriend, who had driven her to the airport, called her over a text message that he had received from Tomas. It was a photo of him lying in her bed masturbating. And the caption he wrote said, "You may get to drive her to the airport, but I'm the one in her bed." How he knew that Shiloh did not have security cameras and where she kept her key, she never found out. Andrew had called the police to report a breaking and entering, but there was no trace left behind. Shiloh didn't know what to do. She tried to report the incident to Tomas's boss, but he said that although he felt for her, Tomas was no longer his responsibility, as he had not shown up for work and that he had been fired accordingly. Andrew helped her set up cameras, and she never saw Tomas again. But the thought of him in her bed stuck with her until she eventually had to move states.